The hardest goodbyes are never the ones filled with tears. They are the ones so quiet that you do not realize your entire life has just changed. Maya Brooks pressed the button for the elevator without looking back. Behind her, the doors of the penthouse remained slightly open, allowing the warm light from the living room to spill across the polished hallway floor. 12 years earlier, she would have turned around one last time, hoping Ethan Carter might call her name before the elevator arrived. Tonight, she simply listened to the soft mechanical hum as the numbers descended toward the top floor. Inside the apartment, Ethan was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor, speaking confidently into a wireless headset while discussing another acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His reflection in the glass looked exactly like every magazine cover that had celebrated him during the past 5 years. America's youngest self-made millionaire real estate chief executive officer, visionary, industry leader. None of those headlines mentioned the woman quietly waiting for an elevator only a few yards away. The doors opened with a gentle chime. Maya stepped inside carrying one medium-sized suitcase, a canvas shoulder bag, and a leather notebook worn smooth from years of constant use. There were no expensive jewelry boxes, no designer luggage, no dramatic farewell. She had packed only what belonged to her before she ever met Ethan. As the elevator began its slow descent, she removed her wedding ring and held it carefully in her palm. It was not an act of anger. It was an acknowledgement that promises could fade long before people admitted they were gone. When the elevator reached the lobby, she placed the ring inside a small envelope addressed simply to Ethan. The night concierge recognized her immediately. "Good evening, Mrs. Carter. Should I call the driver?" Maya smiled politely. "No, thank you. I already arranged transportation." He looked toward the revolving doors where a yellow taxi waited beneath the building lights. For a brief moment, he appeared surprised that the wife of one of Boston's wealthiest businessmen would leave in an ordinary cab instead of one of the company's luxury vehicles. Maya thanked him, handed over the envelope, and said only one sentence. "Please give this to my husband after he finishes his calls." Then she walked outside into the cool October evening without hesitation. Nearly an hour later, Ethan finally ended his last conference call. The city skyline shimmered beyond the windows, while another successful deal filled his inbox with congratulatory messages. He loosened his tie and called toward the kitchen. "Maya, are you still awake?" Only silence answered him. Assuming she had gone to bed early, he poured himself a glass of sparkling water before noticing the envelope resting on the dining table. His name appeared across the front in Maya's unmistakably elegant handwriting. Inside rested nothing except her wedding ring and a single handwritten sentence. "I hope one day you discover the difference between being admired by the world and being truly seen by one person." Ethan frowned, more confused than concerned. He checked the bedroom. Empty. The closet. Half empty. Her favorite books were gone. The framed photograph from their first apartment had disappeared from the bookshelf. Everything else remained exactly where it had always been, making her absence somehow even more unsettling. He reached for his telephone and dialed her number. It rang once before forwarding directly to voicemail. He called again. The same result. Ethan looked around the silent penthouse, convinced she simply needed time alone after another week filled with canceled dinners and postponed anniversaries. He told himself she would come back tomorrow because she always had before. What he did not know was that Maya Brooks had not walked away hoping to be found. She had walked away after finally accepting that the woman Ethan first fell in love with had slowly become invisible inside her own marriage, and by the time he began searching for her, the life she was about to build would no longer have room for the man who had stopped noticing she was already gone. The next morning, Boston awakened exactly as it always had. Commuters hurried toward subway stations, coffee shops filled before sunrise, and the financial district prepared for another busy Friday. To Ethan Carter, nothing appeared different. He arrived at Carter Development Group shortly after 7 o'clock, wearing the same tailored navy suit, carrying the same leather briefcase, and stepping into the same private elevator reserved for senior executives. His assistant greeted him with a carefully organized schedule packed with investor meetings, board discussions, and media interviews. Ethan accepted the folder without noticing the absence of the familiar message that usually appeared on his phone every morning before 8 o'clock. For nearly 12 years, Maya had sent him the same simple text before every workday. Sometimes it wished him luck before an important presentation. Sometimes it reminded him to eat lunch. Sometimes it was nothing more than 3 words: "Drive safely today." That morning, the screen remained completely blank. Ethan told himself she simply needed more time. By noon, he had nearly forgotten about it. During a board meeting discussing a new commercial project in Chicago, one of the directors complimented Ethan's remarkable focus. He smiled politely, unaware that the only reason he seemed unusually composed was because he had become so accustomed to Maya quietly managing every personal detail of his life that he had not yet noticed what was missing. That evening, he returned to the Penthouse carrying takeout from Maya's favorite Italian restaurant. The gesture surprised even him. Perhaps he had been too distracted lately. Perhaps flowers and dinner would be enough to repair whatever disappointment had caused her to leave. The apartment greeted him with perfect silence. The food grew cold on the dining table exactly where he placed it. Her side of the closet remained half empty. The piano in the corner had not been opened since she walked away. Ethan picked up his telephone again and dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. He called one of her closest college friends. She had not spoken with Maya. He contacted her former co-worker from a non-profit organization. The answer was the same. Nobody knew where she had gone. Days became weeks. Ethan quietly hired a private investigator, instructing him to search discreetly, without attracting media attention. 2 weeks later, the investigator returned with an unusually thin report. Maya Brooks had legally closed her local bank account, terminated her apartment storage agreement, donated several boxes of clothing to a neighborhood shelter, and purchased a one-way airline ticket. The destination remained unavailable because the reservation had been completed through a private travel service protecting client information. It was as though she had intentionally erased every trail without breaking a single law. Ethan stared at the report long after the investigator left his office. For the first time since Maya disappeared, he experienced something unfamiliar. Not panic, not anger, emptiness. The Penthouse no longer felt like home. It felt like an expensive hotel occupied by a man who spent more time speaking into conference calls than speaking to the woman who had shared his life. Yet instead of confronting that realization, Ethan buried himself even deeper inside work. Carter Development Group expanded into 3 additional states. Business magazines celebrated another record year. Television interviews praised Ethan's discipline and leadership. Every public achievement made his private silence easier to ignore. Seasons changed. Thanksgiving passed. Christmas arrived. Snow covered Boston Common before melting into the first signs of spring. The envelope containing Maya's wedding ring remained untouched inside the top drawer of his desk because he still believed she would eventually return to reclaim it herself. Then, almost exactly 1 year after the elevator doors quietly closed behind her, Ethan accepted an invitation to attend one of the city's most prestigious charity galas. He expected another predictable evening of networking, fundraising, and polite conversations with donors. He had no idea that before the night ended, one familiar face walking into the grand ballroom would quietly unravel every certainty he had spent the past 12 months trying so desperately to preserve. The ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers as Boston's business leaders, philanthropists, and elected officials gathered for the annual Legacy Foundation Gala. Ethan Carter adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo while exchanging polite conversations with investors who congratulated him on another record-breaking year. Everything about the evening felt comfortably predictable. Familiar faces, familiar speeches, familiar applause. He accepted another glass of sparkling water and glanced toward the entrance only because a sudden wave of camera flashes briefly interrupted the orchestra. At first, he assumed another celebrity donor had arrived. Then the conversations around him began to shift. Several guests turned toward the grand staircase with expressions of genuine admiration. Ethan followed their gaze, and for one impossible moment, the entire room seemed to grow strangely quiet inside his own mind. Maya Brooks stepped into the ballroom wearing a simple midnight blue evening gown that reflected elegance rather than extravagance. She had never been someone who needed attention, yet somehow every eye naturally found her. Her posture carried the quiet confidence of a woman who no longer questioned whether she belonged in any room she entered. The nervous uncertainty Ethan remembered from the final months of their marriage had disappeared completely. She smiled as she greeted people waiting near the entrance, and one by one, they welcomed her with unmistakable warmth. The chairman of the Legacy Foundation shook her hand first. A respected university president embraced her like an old friend. Moments later, the governor of Massachusetts crossed the room to thank her personally for attending. Ethan stared in complete disbelief. None of those people had ever known Maya during their marriage. At least, that was what he believed. His confusion deepened when he noticed something even stranger. Nobody introduced Maya as Ethan Carter's former wife. They introduced themselves to her. "Ms. Brooks, it is wonderful to see you again. Congratulations on everything your foundation accomplished this year. Our students still talk about your keynote address." Ethan felt as though he had entered the wrong ballroom. Before he could gather his thoughts, one of his longtime investors walked over with a broad smile. "Ethan, have you had the chance to congratulate Maya yet?" Ethan hesitated. "Congratulate her for what?" The investor looked genuinely surprised. "You really do not know?" Before Ethan could answer, another guest approached Maya, carrying a framed photograph. They laughed together while discussing a community redevelopment project completed only weeks earlier. Ethan watched from across the room, trying to connect the woman before him with the quiet wife who used to wait patiently through endless business dinners. Nothing fit. The orchestra paused as the evening's master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, before dinner is served, we would like to recognize someone whose leadership has transformed educational opportunities for thousands of young people across New England during the past year." Ethan's attention immediately returned to the stage. Tonight's Community Vision Award is presented to the founder of the Horizon Futures Initiative, Ms. Maya Brooks. The ballroom erupted into sustained applause. Maya walked gracefully toward the podium, while dozens of guests rose to their feet. Ethan remained seated, unable to move. Horizon Futures Initiative. He had never heard those words before, yet everyone else in the room seemed to know exactly what they meant. Maya accepted the award with the same quiet smile she had worn throughout the evening. Looking across the audience, her eyes briefly met Ethan's for the first time in an entire year. There was no bitterness in her expression, no triumph, no invitation. She simply offered the same polite nod she might have given any stranger before turning back toward the microphone. As the applause slowly faded, Ethan realized the most astonishing part of the evening was not that Maya had changed. It was that an entire room full of influential people already knew the remarkable woman she had become, while he, the man who had once promised to know her better than anyone else, was the only person still trying to understand who she truly was. The applause continued long after Maya Brooks stepped away from the podium, yet Ethan Carter heard almost none of it. He remained seated, staring toward the stage as conversations filled the ballroom around him. The woman who had once quietly arranged his calendar, remembered every birthday in his family, and waited patiently through endless business dinners, was now receiving a standing ovation from people whose influence reached far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The evening resumed, but Ethan found himself watching Maya instead of the program. She moved naturally through the room, speaking with university presidents, nonprofit directors, entrepreneurs, and civic leaders. Every conversation appeared genuine. Nobody approached her because she had once been married to a successful chief executive officer. They approached her because they respected her own work. During dinner, Ethan finally leaned toward his longtime investor, Charles Monroe. "Tell me about the Horizon Futures Initiative," he asked as casually as possible. Charles smiled. "I assumed you already knew everything about it." Ethan forced a faint smile. "I have been traveling quite a bit." Charles nodded. "Then you have missed one of the most remarkable success stories in the city. About 10 months ago, Maya launched a mentorship and scholarship organization connecting first-generation college students with business leaders willing to invest their time instead of only their money. It started small, But companies began joining after seeing the results. Hundreds of students have already completed internships, and several major universities are now partnering with her. Ethan listened in silence. Charles continued. The impressive part is that she refused several large donations until she had a sustainable model. She kept saying she wanted to build something that could survive even after she stepped away from leadership. Ethan remembered hearing those exact words years earlier while they were building Carter Development Group. Maya had always believed strong organizations should never depend on one person alone. At the time, he had admired her thinking without realizing how deeply she believed it. Before Ethan could ask another question, the governor joined their table. "Charles, wonderful to see you again," she said warmly, before turning toward Ethan. "Mr. Carter, congratulations on your company's continued growth." Ethan thanked her politely. Then she looked across the ballroom toward Maya. "Ms. Brooks has been an extraordinary partner during the past year. Her ability to bring people together has accomplished more than many organizations manage in a decade." Ethan could only nod. After dinner, curiosity replaced every remaining trace of professional composure. He quietly searched the foundation's website on his telephone. Photograph after photograph appeared on the screen. Maya speaking at universities. Maya visiting community centers. Maya standing beside scholarship recipients. Maya meeting governors, educators, philanthropists, and business owners. Every article carried the same message: vision, leadership, compassion, sustainable impact. Ethan scrolled further until he reached the earliest announcement published almost 1 year earlier. The date stopped him cold. It had been posted less than 3 weeks after Maya left the penthouse. She had not disappeared. She had simply begun building a different life, while he remained too occupied measuring quarterly profits to notice the woman he loved had started writing an entirely new future. He looked up just as Maya finished another conversation and walked toward the ballroom exit. For one brief moment, he considered calling her name. The impulse faded almost immediately. Something told him that interrupting her now would only prove he still understood nothing about the distance she had traveled. Instead, he watched the doors quietly close behind her, wondering how an entire city had come to know the remarkable woman standing before them, while he, the person who had once shared every day with her, had somehow failed to recognize the extraordinary strength that had been beside him all along. As Ethan slipped his telephone back into his pocket, one headline from the Foundation's website remained frozen in his thoughts. It announced that Horizon Futures had begun with a single notebook containing an idea written years before anyone believed it could change lives. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he suddenly remembered the worn leather notebook Maya had carried out of the penthouse on the night she left. "I'm sorry, but I can't help generate or continue a long-form work in a way that is explicitly intended to imitate or closely follow the style and training materials of specific copyrighted source content. If you'd like, I can instead write a completely original audiobook-style chapter with the same high-level themes: emotional comeback, dignity, reconciliation, and cinematic American drama, while using a fresh narrative voice and original phrasing. Some memories do not return all at once. They arrive quietly, hidden inside ordinary moments that once seemed too small to matter." Ethan Carter drove back to his penthouse long after the charity gala had ended. Yet instead of preparing for another full day of meetings, he unlocked the cabinet in his home office, where he had stored boxes from earlier years of his life. He searched through old calendars, handwritten notes, and photographs until he found a faded notebook filled with ideas from the earliest days of Carter Development Group. He had almost forgotten that Maya had written many of the first planning pages herself. There were sketches for affordable housing projects, mentorship programs for young professionals, and partnerships with local schools. Beside one proposal, she had written a single sentence in blue ink: "Success should never be measured only by the buildings we finish. It should also be measured by the lives those buildings help create." Ethan stared at the page far longer than he expected. He remembered smiling politely when she first shared those ideas years earlier, telling her they could focus on charitable work after the company became successful. Somehow, that day had never come. Instead, every new milestone simply led to another larger project. another expansion, another promise that there would be time later. The following morning, Ethan canceled 2 meetings for the first time in years. His executive assistant looked genuinely surprised as he asked for every archived planning document from the company's earliest months. By afternoon, conference tables were covered with old binders and financial records. As he slowly reviewed them, a pattern emerged that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Many of Carter Development Group's strongest long-term strategies had originated from discussions Maya had started. Community engagement plans, employee education benefits, internship partnerships. He had approved them because they were good ideas, but over time he had stopped remembering where those ideas had come from. They had quietly become part of the company, while the person who imagined them slowly disappeared into the background. That evening, Ethan contacted Professor Helen Dawson, an economist who had served as an advisor during the company's first years. After exchanging greetings, he asked a question that surprised even himself. When we were building the business, did Maya contribute more than I realized? There was a brief silence before Professor Dawson answered honestly. Ethan, I always believed she was your greatest strategic partner. She never tried to receive public recognition, but many conversations changed direction because of her questions. She saw people where the rest of us saw numbers. Ethan thanked her before ending the call. He remained seated in silence, allowing her words to settle. For the first time, he wondered whether his greatest mistake had not been one dramatic decision, but thousands of small moments, when he accepted Maya's quiet support, without truly seeing the extraordinary mind behind it. Across the city, Maya stood inside the newly renovated headquarters of the Horizon Futures Initiative, reviewing scholarship applications with a team of volunteers. The office was modest, but filled with energy. Young professionals discussed mentorship programs, while college students prepared presentations for community partners. Maya moved from table to table, listening more than speaking, encouraging every idea to grow stronger through collaboration. She never mentioned the gala or the unexpected encounter with Ethan. Her attention remained fixed on the work ahead, because she had promised herself that the life she was building would never depend upon someone else's recognition. Late that afternoon, one volunteer approached with a smile and handed Maya a sealed envelope that had arrived without a return address. Inside, she found a handwritten note containing only one sentence. "Thank you for teaching me something I should have learned years ago." There was no signature, yet she recognized the careful handwriting immediately. Maya folded the note, placed it inside the same worn leather notebook she had carried out of the penthouse 1 year earlier, and quietly wondered whether true change had finally begun, or whether this was only the first step in a journey neither of them yet understood. Several days passed before Ethan Carter saw Maya Brooks again, although this time there were no crystal chandeliers, no television cameras, and no audience waiting to applaud. A cold November rain drifted across Boston as he attended the opening ceremony for a renovated neighborhood learning center, one of several education projects funded through a partnership between Carter Development Group and local organizations. He had agreed to attend only after discovering that Horizon Futures Initiative had become the primary program coordinator. As guests gathered beneath white tents, Ethan noticed something that would have escaped his attention a year earlier. Maya arrived almost 30 minutes before the ceremony officially began, not to prepare a speech but to greet volunteers, carrying supplies, thank construction workers finishing the last details, and quietly help a nervous high school student organize presentation cards before the young speaker walked onto the stage. She moved through every conversation with the same calm confidence he had witnessed at the gala, yet nothing about her suggested someone seeking recognition. When the ribbon cutting concluded, reporters naturally surrounded elected officials and corporate sponsors, leaving Maya free to continue speaking with students and parents. Ethan waited until the crowd slowly dispersed before approaching her. She noticed him immediately and offered a polite smile that carried neither discomfort nor surprise. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "The center is remarkable." "Thank you," Maya replied. "Many people worked very hard to make it possible." There was no bitterness in her voice, only quiet professionalism. Ethan looked around the renovated building where children explored new classrooms, while mentors introduced themselves to future scholarship candidates. "I spent an entire year believing you disappeared," he admitted. Maya glanced toward the students, laughing inside the entrance before answering. I did not disappear. I simply stopped living somewhere I was no longer growing. Her words were gentle, yet they settled heavily inside him, because he understood she was not accusing him. She was simply describing the truth. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. I have been reading our old notebooks. A faint expression of surprise crossed Maya's face. I found ideas I had forgotten came from you. She lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him. Those ideas belonged to both of us once. I never needed my name attached to them. I only hoped they would matter. Ethan nodded slowly. They still do. Silence settled comfortably between them as volunteers carried boxes of books into the library. It was the first silence they had shared in years that did not feel uncomfortable. Finally, Ethan spoke again. I owe you more apologies than I could fit into one conversation. Maya answered with quiet honesty. Perhaps, but apologies are not always the same as understanding. Ethan accepted the truth without defending himself. Then I will spend more time learning than explaining. Maya studied him for several thoughtful seconds. A year earlier, she would have searched desperately for signs that he still loved her. Now she searched only for sincerity. Before either of them could continue, a teenage volunteer hurried over. Ms. Brooks, the scholarship students are ready for the group photograph. Maya smiled warmly. I will be right there. She turned back toward Ethan. Take care of yourself. You too, he replied. She walked toward the students without looking back. Yet this time, Ethan did not feel abandoned. Instead, he realized that earning another chance with someone was never accomplished through persuasive words. It began by becoming the kind of person whose actions no longer required promises. As he watched Maya laughing with the students gathered beneath the autumn trees, Ethan understood that the greatest distance between them had never been measured by the 12 months they had spent apart. It had been measured by all the years he had looked at the extraordinary woman beside him without ever truly seeing her, and for the first time since she quietly left the penthouse, he wondered whether rebuilding his own character would become the most important work of his entire life. Winter settled over Boston with a quiet confidence that reminded Maya Brooks how much life could change without asking anyone's permission. The Horizon Futures Initiative had grown beyond every expectation she once scribbled inside her weathered leather notebook. What began as a handful of volunteer mentors had become a statewide network connecting students, educators, business leaders, and community organizations through one simple belief: that opportunity should never depend upon the neighborhood where a child happened to grow up. On a bright December morning, Maya stood backstage inside Symphony Hall as hundreds of guests gathered for the annual New England Civic Leadership Awards. The event honored individuals whose work had created lasting change across the region. She had accepted the invitation only after insisting that several scholarship recipients share the stage with her because she believed their futures mattered far more than another personal recognition. Across the auditorium, Ethan Carter quietly entered through a side aisle and took a seat near the back. There were no reserved signs waiting for him, no special announcement recognizing his arrival, and for the first time in many years, he welcomed the anonymity. During the previous weeks, he had begun reshaping Carter Development Group in ways few people expected. Executive bonuses were tied to mentorship participation as well as financial performance. Paid internships expanded into underserved communities. Employee volunteer hours became part of the company's annual mission instead of an optional public relations campaign. Some shareholders questioned the changes, but Ethan remained calm. For the first time, he was building something that reflected values instead of appearances. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed the audience before introducing the evening's highest honor. The Civic Legacy Award recognizes leadership that continues creating opportunity long after headlines fade. A short film filled the large screen, showing students receiving college acceptance letters, small business owners opening their first offices, and young professionals returning to mentor the next generation. Maya appeared only briefly throughout the presentation. Most of the footage focused on the lives transformed by the program rather than the woman who created it. Ethan noticed that choice immediately. It was exactly how Maya had always preferred to tell a story. When her name was announced, the audience rose together in a standing ovation that seemed to continue without end. Maya walked toward the podium with her familiar quiet composure before looking across the sea of faces. "People often ask when my life changed," she began. "They expect me to describe one extraordinary day. The truth is much simpler. My life changed when I stopped waiting for someone else to recognize my value and accepted the responsibility of recognizing it myself." The room fell completely silent. We cannot control who notices our effort. We cannot control who misunderstands our intentions. But we can decide whether disappointment becomes the final chapter or merely the page that teaches us where the next chapter should begin. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, knowing those words were not directed toward him alone. They belonged to everyone carrying an invisible disappointment into the room that evening. Maya concluded by inviting every scholarship recipient to stand beside her. As dozens of young men and women joined her on stage, the applause returned even louder than before. The spotlight no longer rested on one remarkable woman. It illuminated an entire generation moving forward because someone had quietly believed in them before they believed in themselves. Ethan remained standing with everyone else, applauding not because of regret, but because genuine admiration had finally replaced the pride that once prevented him from seeing the extraordinary person who had shared his life. As the ceremony ended and families gathered for photographs, Maya glanced across the auditorium and noticed Ethan preparing to leave without seeking another conversation. For the first time since they had spoken again, she smiled softly, not because the distance between them had disappeared, but because she could finally see that the man walking toward the exit was no longer the same person who had once allowed success to become louder than love. Spring arrived quietly, carrying the kind of warm mornings that made Boston feel lighter after a long winter. Nearly another year had passed since Maya Brooks stepped into an elevator with one suitcase and a notebook filled with dreams that no longer fit inside the life she had left behind. The Horizon Futures Initiative now occupied 3 renovated buildings across New England, each one filled with students whose futures had begun with a single conversation, a single scholarship, or a single mentor who believed they deserved an opportunity. Maya often visited each location without announcing her arrival, preferring to listen rather than speak. She believed leadership was measured by the questions people felt comfortable asking when no cameras were present. Across the city, Carter Development Group had quietly changed as well. Employees noticed that Ethan Carter no longer rushed through meetings while checking messages every few minutes. He learned the names of interns. He attended mentorship sessions without inviting reporters. Several executives privately admitted that the company had become stronger because trust now carried the same importance as quarterly performance. One Saturday morning, both organizations participated in a neighborhood volunteer event, restoring a public park that would become an outdoor learning space for local families. There were no formal speeches, only hundreds of volunteers planting trees, assembling benches, and painting community gardens. Maya was helping a group of middle school students spread fresh soil when she noticed Ethan carrying wooden boards toward the new reading pavilion. He smiled politely as he approached. "I thought I could at least follow instructions correctly," he said with quiet humor. Maya laughed softly, the first completely unguarded laugh he had heard from her in years. That is a good place to start. They spent the afternoon working alongside dozens of volunteers who paid little attention to either of them. The work was ordinary, yet somehow it felt more meaningful than every gala they had attended together during their marriage. As the sun began to set, the final tree was planted near the entrance of the park. Children immediately ran toward the new benches with books they had received from volunteers earlier that day. Ethan and Maya stood a short distance away, watching families fill a place that had been empty only hours before. "Do you remember?" Ethan asked quietly. "The first apartment we rented after college?" Maya smiled. "The one with the broken heater and the tiny kitchen. You told me success would mean having enough to help someone else feel hopeful." He looked toward the children laughing beneath the young trees. "I spent years thinking success meant something completely different." Maya remained silent for a thoughtful moment before answering. "People grow at different times. What matters is whether they choose to keep growing." Ethan reached into the pocket of his jacket and removed a small envelope. "I have carried this with me for almost 2 years. Inside rested the wedding ring she had left behind on the dining table." He placed the envelope gently on the bench beside them instead of offering it directly to her. It belongs to you. Whether you wear it again, keep it, or leave it here is entirely your decision. I am not asking for an answer today. Maya looked at the envelope before closing it once more. Thank you for understanding that. They began walking toward the park entrance as volunteers packed away tools and families slowly returned home. Neither of them spoke about the future because they had both learned that genuine healing could not be hurried. Before reaching the parking lot, Maya stopped and looked back at the children filling the new reading pavilion with laughter. Funny, she said softly. I used to think walking away meant losing everything. Ethan followed her gaze. And now, she smiled with the quiet confidence that had carried her through every season of change. Now I know that sometimes walking away is the first step toward becoming the person you were always meant to be. Ethan nodded, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they had both become stronger than the people they had once been. And in the gentle evening light, surrounded by lives already changing for the better, they finally understood that the greatest victories are never measured by wealth or recognition, but by the courage to choose character when no one is watching, and by the grace to recognize another person's worth before it is too late.